In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head, a podcast by two therapists about how capitalism impacts our emotional and interpersonal and psychological lives. And this is Max Golding, LMFT. We got Harriet Fraud, PhD, over here. Hey, Harriet. Hello.
Hi.
And before we jump into our exciting topic for the day, big shout out to our patrons First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, and Bandila MC Manga, and obviously Liam once more.
Yes.
We cannot thank you enough for all the editing and social media stuff you do. And with that out of the way, what we're going to talk about today is, I'm going to use the phrase with big air quotes, class guilt, because we just decided in a conversation that that's not the right phrase for it. But so listeners are probably familiar with this concept of white guilt. That's been talked about for a long time, or white people say, I feel really guilty knowing that I have this white privilege, and people of color don't have this privilege, and so I feel guilty. And so that's like a relatively well-known concept. And something I was talking about with Harriet was, well, what about this? I don't think we really talk about if you either came from a more impoverished situation. I mean, I'm actually a relatively good example of this, like grew up on kind of Section 8 public housing type of stuff with single mom. But I'm now in a more middle-class position as a therapist. So I did actually climb the socioeconomic ladder. And I've talked to a lot of other people about this, whether they did the same, whether they sort of climbed up a bit, or they were just born into or inherited some wealth or something, and they're doing a little bit better than those at the bottom of the ladder. And this is a kind of guilt, and guilt and shame, by the way, I think they're relatively interchangeable. I know some people make some big distinctions between them. I don't personally think it matters a whole lot, so we might use terms shame and guilt interchangeably. I think it's something that I don't think is talked about much, and it should be. I don't want to say it's more important than white guilt or male guilt or something like that, but it's just sort of not. I think it's like hidden under a rock in the popular conversation. So
I agree, because I think class is the most repressed discourse in the United States, and people don't talk about it, and they don't for a political reason, which is you can absorb. There's room at the top if you want to absorb black capitalists or females at the top. But class transformation is a different thing. So I think we should start by defining what we mean as class.
Right.
And the way I would define it, which is Marxist, is that class is a relationship to the wealth in a society. Who produces the wealth and who gets to take that wealth and use that wealth. And so in terms of class, there are two big classes in the United States. One of them is the employer class, the owner class, who has people working for them who earn a lot more than they're paid. And that extra goes to the boss or the board of directors. The other is the employee class, those people who work giving over their lives to create wealth for someone else and have a job. And even if they are working, let's say, in a public hospital, they then are the kind of workers that keep the capitalist system going. So they are kind of subsumed class workers that help keep the whole thing going. But just as the classes were divided under slavery, the owners and the producers or slaves who were the property of the owners, or in feudalism, the serfs who were working the land and giving a large share to the lord of the manor who didn't work, or today's workers who produce wealth for someone else who accumulates it and decides how and where to spend it. And I think that's really very important as a division, and that is what was repressed. It started coming back in 2011 with Occupy, the 1% and the 99%. And it really caught on because class and the idea of class was severely repressed in the McCarthy era of the 50s, when the Communist Party and the Socialist parties were strong, and so were the unions. And those three forces are what created the New Deal, and the employer class decided to bust that up by creating a Red Scare that condemned the communists and jailed many of them for the conspiracy to overthrow the government. No evidence, just conspiracy. And the two socialist parties at the time, which were considered fellow travelers, and the labor movement, which was militant enough to also help force the New Deal. They were all condemned as Reds or Pinkos. Well, this country is only now starting to recover from that. And I think that there are a whole lot of little class distinctions that are entered to make some people feel better than others, like, oh, we're middle class, which a lot of poor people actually say, or we're in the professional managerial class. Okay, but do you own the clinic where you work and accumulate the extra from all the therapists that you hire? Or are you one of those therapists that works for a wage? Or are you an independent worker who works for yourself and has your own surplus and has to decides, what do I do with this extra money that I've earned? I allocate it to this or that. There are these classes, and class exists everywhere. It even exists at home. The traditional family, the wife, by virtue of her birth as woman, created cooked foods, domestic services, sexual services, emotional services, childbearing, and child rearing. And a little bit of the proceeds of that went to herself, and the rest went to her husband, who was the king of his castle. That has changed radically in a revolutionary and usually unremarked class change in the United States. But if we look at class as who produces the wealth and who gets to accumulate it, either independent workers do that for themselves, or workers in enterprises do that for someone else, then okay, you look at who is earning a living off the labor of other people. They're in one class. And who is doing that labor? They're in another class. Also, we have to understand that many of the great revolutionary leaders who were the ones who were educated, and therefore their parents were not desperately poor. Che Guevara's parents sent him to medical school. He came from privilege. Fidel Castro went to law school. He came from privilege. Mao Zedong was not poor. Really, this is bizarre. Alexandra Kollontai was in the aristocracy. She who is the first powerful feminist in the world. So that a lot of people's politics depend on, okay, where do you stand in the class system? Do you want to replace the employer class and have a cooperative economy so that we all decide what to do with what we all create? Or are you happy working for someone else and letting them profit off your labor? Those are the big questions of the day, but they're muted because of the barrage of anti-communist education we all get that confuses the class issue. Sorry, Max, I kind of hogged
No,
that.
it's okay. Well, but I think that no, that's a good distinction, because I think, well, two things. One is that, I mean, I do think that different sort of strata analyses, like professional managerial class, I actually do think there is a relatively, I think it can be helpful, like in some of the analyses of, so for the Democratic Party, for example, right, like the big kind of DNC Democratic Party, they have over the last, 30 whatever years, they've mostly just catered to, if you look at like sort of income brackets, again, this is moving away from a Marxian class definition, but they typically are not really trying to curry the votes of the poor, like those in the kind of bottom income bracket strata. They're typically going for people with that have at least completed college, that live in like bigger coastal, bigger cities, like that. So that concept of like professional managerial class, that sort of there's, I don't know if you've followed this much, but there's a sort of online meme that makes fun of liberals of like, oh, after Hillary wins the presidency, we're going to go get brunch. It's like brunch is like this weird sort of joke. It's like a mockery of like,
Right.
these types of liberals or whatever. So again, I think it's unhelpful in the sense that like it's actually just creating these sort of stereotypes that continues to reinforce our confusion about what class is. But on the other, these distinctions across like income brackets between like very poor, a little bit less poor, sort of middle of the road, and then like middle upper. I think they are maybe almost in the sense that like the way that race and gender psychologically have manifested now into like real enough distinctions where like if I'm shaped to be white guy and you're shaped to be like black woman, there's actually like intrapsychic, interpersonal things that are going to be happening, even though again, like we're just working class people, the constructs have played themselves out. So anyway, that's just, I guess, in my defense of like the PMC definition, all that. I think there's some usefulness to it. But at the end of the day, let's just maybe zoom back in. So the concept of guilt itself, or guilt or shame, is it's a sort of like self-criticism emotion. It's an emotion that is meant to, I think it's supposed to be corrective. Like you're supposed to kind of feel bad if you've harmed someone or you've done something against maybe some agreed upon social norms, or you've broken a moral code or something, and you're supposed to kind of feel bad. Like that's the whole point of guilt. I think evolutionarily it evolved in these like social settings. This is like my theory. I probably didn't make it up, but to establish this thing where you like physiologically, internally, psychically feel bad because you did a thing, and then in feeling bad, you're like slowing down. Maybe you're reflecting more, and you want to maybe course correct within your the moral code of your society or whatever. So I think that's probably where guilt came from. And so guilt can be tremendously helpful if you realize I've done wrong. I need to kind of think about this,
Yes.
maybe like repent or remorse or whatever, correct things, make amends. So the concept, this is why I think like white guilt is typically unhelpful, because by being born into a racialized class of economic entitlement, which is what whiteness is, you never chose that. You actually have never harmed anyone by being born white. So I guess that's my, so
Right.
white guilt is actually kind of like pointless. And also it's like debilitating, because like once you feel bad, like what are you supposed to do once you feel bad? Once you feel bad, you're not going to do anything about anything, right?
Yeah.
You're like, why should I go to the protest? Why should I
Yeah.
join the
I
group? Why
feel
should I do
too
anything? I'm
bad.
just going to stay in my room and feel bad or whatever.
Right.
So I think this, again, class guilt isn't the right term for it, but I think this, again, I have felt this way, so another term for this actually is survivor's guilt. I have a client who, similar as me, like climbed through the socioeconomic strata and thinks back on their family members and the people they grew up with, and they're like, well, they're still struggling. They got all these addictions, they got all these like money problems, so and so just like they got a divorce, and now the person has now they're like living out of their car, and this person's like, well, I just feel bad because like I made it, and why didn't I stick around to help them? So like survivor's guilt, that kind of, or everybody else dies in the burning building, and like you make it out, and you just live with this like, I did something wrong, I should have done it differently. It still isn't a particularly accurate emotion. Like it kind of makes
No.
sense that you'd move there and you'd internalize it a bit. Like it makes sense. But
Also, Max,
uh-huh.
it's if you did something wrong, that's one thing. If
Mm-hmm.
you feel you're wrong because of where you were born rather than what you're doing to change this society,
Yeah.
then there's something really sick and wrong about that. Because what's
Mm-hmm.
needed, and
Mm-hmm.
if you look at who was in the original Bolshevik Party and who joined the Long March and who
Mm-hmm.
was a spearhead of the Cuban Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
they were not necessarily poor people, often so bowed down by trying to survive.
Mm-hmm.
They were people who had a vision of a more just society and they wanted to be part of it. And that's what counts. That's what
Yeah.
counts.
Well,
You could be the
yeah.
scab who goes in and weakens the union by working because you're poor. So
Mm-hmm.
what? You have which side are you on?
Mm-hmm.
That's the most important thing to ask.
Yeah.
Which side are you on and what are you doing about it?
Right.
Rather than where were you born and what did your parents do for a living?
Right. So I totally agree. And I think that's kind of where we wanted to head with this, because we wanted to first, and also if anybody resonates with this thing of like, I climbed up over people, or I was born into a strata that's above people in terms of income or wealth or whatever, we'd really like to hear from you. So email us, by the way. It's not just in your head at gmail.com. Because I've wondered, the more I talked with a few friends about it, it seemed like it was actually it almost seemed like it was stronger than maybe white guilt and male guilt and all of that. And it's not really talked about. And so I think we want to kind of correct that and say, maybe we could just offer some examples of like what you can do, how to deal with your income guilt, or whatever we want to call it. Because so let's say that you are, or maybe, okay, I'll paint the picture this way. If you realize one day that, oh man, I'm a programmer, or I am a professor, I don't know, I'm in some situation where I make okay money, and I don't know, I inherited this home, my parents died and they own this home, and now I own this house, and like I don't have to pay rent to anybody. And then you realize, man, there's people out there that they work at McDonald's, and then they work at Jack in the Box, and they work at Walmart, and then they have to like Uber on the weekend, and oh my God, they have 4 jobs and they have no time. And then you've developed this sort of socialist politics in the last few years, where you say, man, well, those are real working class people, and me, I'm not, I don't struggle that much. And so, and then you like feel bad about it. Something to keep in mind is that somebody that is actually that busy can't really attend a lot of meetings. They can't attend like activist meetings. I mean, maybe they can, but it's actually less likely, because they're extremely exhausted. They, especially if they have a family. So like you work your 2 jobs, you get home, you're exhausted. Now you have to like feed the kids or whatever. So your actual time constraints are so extreme that it's just less, in terms of time management, it's less likely for someone in that position to be like super politically active. Okay. You, on the other hand, if you just work 1 job, or I don't know, no jobs, if you're like what they call like a trust fund kid or something, I don't think it's a bad thing for you to either like join DSA or join the IWW and become like a workplace organizing trainer or something. Like I think it's almost better once you realize, well, I actually do have the time, and I have some education, so I'm pretty smart. And if you do some self-assessment, you realize, well, I have a lot of different skills. I'm good at writing. I could write press releases. Maybe I can edit the Google Docs. Maybe I could make a website for the group. Maybe I can, I have good people skills. I could facilitate meetings. I can get people to raise their hand before they speak in the meeting, in the big room. Anything like that, where if once it occurs to you that you are actually a useful person for a movement that's trying to build a more just society, I almost think at that point, it's maybe, I don't want to say obligation, but you're in a much better position than someone that's just barely scraping by, right? So instead of feeling bad about yourself, or using the guilt as a sort of this reinforcing excuse or a self-fulfilling prophecy of, well, since I'm not like a McDonald's worker, I couldn't unionize my workplace. Like at my workplace, there's no grievances. Like in our tech job, we all get paid a bunch. We have great benefits. So like you should probably unionize that workplace too. So
yes, you could.
Yeah.
And also, the point is, why slap a label on yourself? Say, what am I doing to create a more just society? What am I doing? Not what did my parents do for a living? Or do I have their piano? Or do I have their home? What am I doing? Am I just sitting there feeling sorry for myself because I don't know what to do because I'm not working class? Or am I going out and joining things to try to create a society where nobody has the right to appropriate the wealth off of somebody else's labor? That would be a very useful thing to do, no matter who you are. And whether you're a professor or whether you're a ditch digger, those are important questions. Just like it's important for the ditch digger to say, I'm no worse because I dig ditches, or I'm no worse if you're in a hospital because I clean up other people's vomit, than the doctor. Why the hell is he paid so much more? The structure of the hospital is a class structure that penalizes people with less education and overprivileges others. We should be sharing. We're all essential to the healing of people here. If the place is filthy, they'll get infected. So we should share the proceeds and make the decisions, not be ruled by a hospital board who's trying to cut corners and make more money. No. If you really are against class divisions between people, then you realize that's a savage way to divide people against each other, to humiliate some people and make others arrogant and narcissistic, of which our late president was quite an emblem. And I want to defeat that system. I want to live in a better world where we have greater kindness and where we do not have the basis on which we live to be one where some people labor and the other people pocket the extras and get a bare minimum wage, which is always being negotiated. So if I were the Waltons who own Walmart, it's the richest family in the world, or if I were Jeff Bezos, I could say, oh my God, I have billions. What can I do to stop class divisions? Even if I make my money this way. Engels owned a factory. Marx and Engels were partners here. And he supported Marx to write Capital. Very useful thing. And he was a participant in struggle. And that was wonderful. It's not a moral thing. Who are you? How much money do you have? What kind of job? It's, are you on the side of the people who do the labor getting the proceeds? Or are you on the sides of the people who own stuff getting the most out of their workers and giving them the least? That's the big division.
Harriet, I have a question for you, because I remember, so I know you're not a huge fan of the PMC thing, the professional managerial class. I still think it's kind of helpful. And I remember one thing that like Catherine Liu was saying when I was talking to her was she found some hope in what she called like PMC, like people that are entering more into there's this term class suicide, of people once they realize, okay, I am in actually a better position in terms of the money I make, or I have a salaried job or whatever. So she was saying something that's hopeful is, say, like nurses unions and the nurses unions push for Medicare for all, and that, you know, these are people that are much more the quote unquote, I guess, middle, if you want to look at it that way. And they don't necessarily, I mean, it's arguably a somewhat selfless thing, maybe not selfless, but it's certainly not,
it's a caring job.
Well, yeah, exactly. But I was going to say that, so she gave that as an example of like, those are sort of like PMC type unions that she thinks are actually, that sort of effort is absolutely, it's trying to actually break down the class, the sillier class distinctions between like lower, extra lower, middle, whatever. Right. Like it's actually just saying, no, like we're going to use our power because there's a lot of us. And if we can actually do this on like a national scale, we might be able to get healthcare for everybody. But here's my question for you is, because we both agree, obviously that's really cool and that should keep happening. Yes. But why are say doctors, physicians, other people within that same maybe strata, because that's just within the hospital world, but in this, you could probably, teachers unions, like why are, teachers tend to be more like, we see ourselves as class allies with each other and with the working class generally, but then like educational like administrators are not really into if it's true that we're actually part of the same
that's true,
class strata,
we're educated to see who we're superior to and try to lord it over them, whether it's, I'm superior because I happen to be white, or I'm superior because I have an education and they don't, or because I'm a doctor and she's just a nurse and those people are just orderlies. That there is a huge pressure to look down on those beneath you in the hierarchy. And one of the things that we would want to institute, if we ever could take power, is that people would be evaluated by those beneath them as well as those above them. And that I remember I had a client who was an organizer. They were trying to organize doctors, because doctors now mainly work for corporations. They're not your little independent earner. They try to become partners in medical establishments that make profit off of their labor. But the doctors didn't want to look at themselves that way. They wanted to imagine themselves as superior, because there's a big pressure in capitalist society like ours to consider yourself better than. And so I am in the professional managerial class.
Right. So that's that. So, okay. So that to me is key. That's probably, I think, where we agree on the PMC thing, because I think it's a sort of grift. It's a scam that
Yes.
I think the ruling class sort of, I don't know if anybody sat in dark rooms, or it's just a sort of systemic, like derived from the design of the system itself. It's probably the latter, in my opinion. But I think that this sort of the psychology piece of this, of like, I am X, I am an X, and therefore I'm better than other people. And the implicit part is I'm better than other people. Like most other sort of psychological privilege concepts, like most white people don't actually think like I'm better than the black people or whatever. But in the same way, I think, but okay, this is what it's hard for me to untangle this. So how is it that it occurred to nurses on a mass scale? Maybe this is just the credit of organizers, really good organizers for decades doing the work. But how is it that it occurred to nurses like, oh, okay, we're all kind of the same here. Right. Whereas for doctors, they're like, we're better than everybody else.
Well, I think doctors are inculcated in we are the kings of the hierarchy. We are served by those beneath us, and we get 3 times more money because we're the ones who bring our patients into the hospital. So the hospital rewards us for it.
So do you think that so incentives have been created in the system so that like yes. Reinforcers, so the managerial strata or the actual sort of ownership class, the people that really are making the decisions within, whether it's like individual workplaces or just, policies within the political system, they're creating incentives within, and which hospitals, this is a sort of microcosm. We're not just talking about hospitals. We're just saying the whole system. But in a hospital setting, do you think that at some point people just figured out, again, because I don't think there's intentionality to the system.
I think there is. I think that partly you learn, look, my husband went to Harvard.
Right.
The first week they were instructed, you will be the leaders of this society. And they got maid service in their rooms. Mm-hmm. They should get used to being above, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because they will be the leaders of tomorrow. And I think that what has happened is the radical unions, the most radical unions are the nurses and the flight attendants, both overwhelmingly female fields. Sarah Nelson, head of the flight attendants union, was the only one who called for a general strike when they wanted the people who are baggage handlers to go in the airports without any money. And she hopefully will run for the AFL-CIO, although they'll try to kill her off in that role. Because, and flight attendants have to speak standard English, mm-hmm. and they have to have some educational requirements, like a college degree. So, but they understand they're workers, no matter whether they're called hostesses or flight attendants or whatever. The airlines are ripping them off. They're doing the labor, and the airlines get the profit. And that is not a nice arrangement. And they're in solidarity with the food providers for the plane and with the people who are the fuel injectors in the plane and so on. Because one of the things the establishment cultivates is divisions between people in terms of race, in terms of sexual preference, in terms of class, in terms of sex, because what the weapon we have is our united mass of people who do the labor to keep this place going. And they want, that's threatening to them.
Right.
They want to disrupt it as much as they can. And that's true of the Democrats, who get their money from the same corporate sponsors that the Republicans do, and basically want to keep the system going. But because the energy in their party is from progressives, they have to do progressive stuff. The Republicans have to serve the most regressive fascistic elements, the racists, the sexists, the corporatists, the evangelists, because those fascists are the energy of their party. And they both want corporate sponsors. We have no choice between capitalism or socialism or anarchy or anything, monarchy or anything else. We have 2 systems with the same capitalist ideology. Only one wants to include more workers in it, keeping the same thing going, but not be as harsh. the other wants it to be more harsh. Okay.
So what
But
do you
we're the
think?
mass. That's why they want to divide us. That's what we have. Our number and our crucial participation in what keeps this society going and what keeps those people rich. Without those warehouse workers, Jeff Bezos wouldn't be rich, right?
So how do we, if we're gonna treat this like a medical psychology problem, we're saying the diagnosis is this sort of useless guilt for the money you make or what your parents did or whatever.
Right.
What's the treatment, you think?
I think the treatment is to say, choose what you stand for and champion it, whether you are a child of the power elite or whether you are the child of the dispossessed. What do you stand for? What are you doing with your life? What are you helping? What are you ignoring? How do you handle it? And that's a question that transforms people and creates a bond. Those organizers that organized the Tenant Farmers Union were organizers from the communist and socialist parties in the South that organized and had successful strikes of black and white tenant farmers who were getting the shaft from the farm owners. And they didn't care if they came from bourgeois families. They were trying to create working class solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
That's what matters, what you do, not who your parents are.
Yeah. So, and I'll chime in on, and I've been leaning more and more into this and try to kind of crystallize this a bit, but I kind of see the two, and I get a little bit narrow-minded and like, this is what I think everyone should do. But I think kind of two routes that I see toward actually getting to something close to socialism in America. One would be a workers' party,
Yes.
and the other would be just a bunch of sort of working class like associational, organizational, like labor unions, tenants unions, and anything that's in that general realm. That would have to be more decentralized. But I guess so. My pitch is, I mean, I've mentioned before, I'm a member of the Class Unity Caucus within DSA. It's a little bit controversial because some people say it's like a class reductionist. They're kind of like hard anti-identity. There's other caucuses in DSA, but there's forces within DSA that are trying to actually make DSA be a workers' party because at present it's not really. It's sort of a mishmash. I guess I only learned this recently, but the history of the DSA is it comes from what they call Harringtonite origins. There were people who, I think because of the Red Scare, honestly, that the idea of like socialist and communist parties that believed in something that might resemble like a USSR or China, like Red Army, kind of like revolutionary, and then, I don't know, famine or gulag related, like terrible atrocity kinds of situations, that the DSA was actually founded, I think in the 70s. I don't remember exactly, but as a sort of the best we're going to ask for is just sort of some reforms like around social democracy, democratic socialism, and that it wasn't, and that so you typically weren't supposed. So it's the way it looks today. If you're a little bit into the DSA world, you can have actually run of the mill kind of liberals that are just sort of just want to kind of be sloganeers about things. That there actually is a fair amount of that. There's sometimes just like anarchists that want to do like mutual aid in the sense of like, sort of like charity in the community or whatever. So there is not a lot of sort of ideological unification within DSA at present. Obviously, we got Bernie. That's that whole situation. It didn't pan out in maybe the concrete sense, but in movement building, it obviously has had enormous positive impacts. But there are some folks in DSA trying to make it so that they're to turn DSA probably in what would be called like a surrogate party, so that you could run it like a political party. You could run people on Democratic Party lines if it felt strategic. You could run them on Republican Party lines where it seems strategic, and to run a whole bunch of electoral reforms so that you can eventually maybe build a third party that's a workers' party.
Yes.
So there's a lot of good strategy in that realm.
There are, and it's worth building,
right?
Because it's what's there. But the main point is guilt is immobilizing. You want to mobilize people around their common interests in having a society in which some people don't get rich off the labor of others who they try to cheat by giving them as little as possible. Now, they're not particularly evil, they're just good capitalists. If you give somebody as much as they make for you, you won't make a profit. And the point is to make a profit for yourself by giving them the least and taking the most you can get away with. That
Well,
divides people and is a horrible way to look at people, and it ought to be changed for everyone's sake to live in a better place.
but yes, absolutely. But to me, there's the question. So let's say people who have this guilt thing develop a sense of class consciousness. The reason I kind of was going to the Workers' Party thing, and then I want to get into the associations piece, is what do you do once you have class consciousness? Because I think another problem here is that we have now a lot of people that probably have class consciousness, but don't actually know what to do. Because to me, like if you identify as a member of the working class, or maybe you consume independent left-wing media products online, such as our podcast and other things, that's not going to get us to. That's not going to solve the contradiction we're talking about. So I just want to say the Workers' Party piece, I think, is one. Another
one. But another is changing consciousness. That is an important thing. And the podcasts are important because once you see the world differently, you make very different decisions. If you think, oh, well, that's the world, this is the way it's always been, there is no alternative, you won't change it.
I think it's the first step. But so the working class party stuff, I think that's because, again, when we talk about any when we talk about, say, socialist communist parties within the US or elsewhere, people obviously had to have class consciousness before they became card-carrying members.
That's right.
But what to me would be just as useless as people wallowing around in guilt in the US is developing a sense of class consciousness and not being a card-carrying member of anything and not participating in anything.
Not participating and trying to change people's consciousness if that's what you're good at, or support unions.
So the Workers' Party stuff I think is important. The other would be, in my view, labor unions and tenants unions and anything that sort of
Absolutely.
is in that realm. And you can always get plugged into something like that. Maybe where you live there isn't a ton, but you can probably look it up and find that there's something. And outside of that, Jane McAlevy's talked about if you're not a part of a union, engage in strike support, engage in support of unions. So if you hear about a strike happening in your city or in your state or something, there's tiny things that you can do to support that effort, which is also tremendously important because the workers that are either going on strike or doing a sit-in or a walkout or whatever, that's the site of that extraction that goes to the top. And it takes tremendous courage and risk for workers to do that. So they need a lot of support, kind of like psychologically, to see that society actually values what they're doing versus like people they kind of don't care or they're opposed. So
that's right. Even if you just bring coffee to the picket line and say, I totally support you, and drive by and give a victory and go to a concert that's raising support. Mm-hmm. But the idea is saying to yourself, whether you're rich or poor or whatever, we don't want to live in a society where the basic economic motive is to give the mass of people the least and take the most for yourself. That's ugly and selfish, and it brings out the worst in people. So we want to change it. You learn in kindergarten. That's not nice.
Yeah.
Capitalism isn't nice. It's a gross way of treating people. And whether you're rich or poor, you may not want to treat people that way.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all I got.
Okay, I think it's a good place to end, even though we can talk and talk and talk. But the good place to end is, where do you stand in terms of the struggle to create a society in which some people don't profit off of trying to cheat other people out of what they deserve? That we should all share. It's what you learn in kindergarten for a good reason, because it makes you civilized. You don't learn and teach kids, grab his truck and run, and then sell it back to him for a quarter. No.
Yeah. Well, and I guess, I'm just I'm gonna keep being almost the behaviorist here. If you decide that you're on the side of the oppressed and the working people or whatever, is that just a thought floating in your mind, or are you doing something that indicates, are you actually engaged in solidarity? I think that's just I guess the examples I gave, I think of as solidarity. I don't think of solidarity as just like kindness. Like, oh, well, I did a kind thing. I said a kind thing. I don't know.
Well, it's
I know
all those
I think
things.
I tend to, maybe it's my DBT training. I tend to, I think, try to push people to the next step a lot. So
That's
apologies if
true.
that
But
sounds like it's too
wherever,
pushy, but
whatever you're doing, whether you're standing up for workers, whether you're standing up for more hospitals and nurses, whether you're standing up for tenants' rights, and it isn't a good idea to let some people own where other people live and have to make money off it. Whatever you're doing, what you do with your life matters. Whether you came from X family or Y family and their amount of money doesn't really matter. It's what are you doing with your life? That's what matters.
yeah. Alrighty,
Oh,
so if
thank you.
anybody listening, if anyone got this far, you can become a patron at patreon.com/it's just in your head. We have a monthly reading discussion group now, every last, I think, Friday of the month. We might switch it to weekends for better attendance. We have a little Discord chat where people talk about the episodes and different related topics. So feel free to support us. We don't care if you don't. If you just like listening and you don't want to chip in a couple bucks, we don't care at all. We
Yeah,
appreciate you.
spreading it around is a very good way of supporting. We love it when you send us money. However, we love you anyway. And if you share this with people and get it around, that's a wonderful service too.
Also feedback. We haven't had any emails in a little while, actually. So we used to get a lot more feedback than we've been getting, and we really, really, really want your feedback. So
Yes.
just even if it's like, if it's critical, if you disagree with, like, we don't care. We actually just want to know what if folks are just relatively passively listening to this driving to work or something, and they're just like, oh, that was interesting, and you don't have a lot of thoughts about it, whatever. But if something like either was like jarring or like anything in the negative or positive realm, if you're like, oh, there's this
Yeah.
insight I just gained, and now suddenly, oh, I'm looking at things differently, or that really resonated with me, we actually would like to hear, because we don't want to just be like talking into the void. We really would
Yes.
like more kind of dialogue, and also to help us like course correct. If we like, I know the Angie Speaks one, for example, is probably, for some people, is probably kind of controversial. Like, it just got into this like heated debate. So if anybody felt like offended, or they really disagreed, or if they really agreed with Angie, or if they really agreed with Harriet, since there was like a big kind of tension there, like, we actually would really like to hear what people think about that, or other guests who have come on, if they said something really profound that you'd never thought about. We would actually really like to know that that's how you felt. So
Yes. So
please
do that.
yeah.
Communicate with us. And
All
thank
right.
you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life, as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work, or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.